Shortly, but nothing is ever that simple when it's Murder One. Celebrating the best of last year's film and television here on BBC One, Lenny Henry presents a star-studded lineup in an hour's time for the British Academy Awards. The main evening news and campaign report first on BBC One with Michael Buerk.
The Tories say Britain's voters are sleepwalking to disaster. John Major's called a vote for Labour a one-way bet on being worse off. Tony Blair said the voters aren't sleeping, they've woken up to the disaster of a fifth Tory government. And loyalists have taken over 2 H-blocks in a protest at the Maze. Good evening. The political parties have been making a final push for the support of undecided voters tonight, just 36 hours from the opening of the polls. The Deputy Prime Minister, Michael Heseltine, apparently referring to Labour's big lead in the opinion surveys, said Britain was sleepwalking to disaster, though later he said he thought the Tories would win handsomely. Tony Blair promised to revive the British dream that each generation will be better than the last. Paddy Ashdown has talked about the greatest third-party breakthrough since the war. Jon Major made his last set-piece speech of this long campaign tonight, and Jon Sopel was there.
The final rally in this marathon Tory election campaign, and suddenly an urgency in the language from the Prime Minister not seen hitherto. Thursday would be a day of destiny, a battle for Britain, a decision that would reverberate down the years. It would be a fight to the last.
And that's why I'm inviting you to join me and go out there and fight right up to the last second of the last minute. Fight to keep our economy booming, to stand firm in Europe, and to keep our United Kingdom as one single, undivided United Kingdom.
In a powerful speech laced with humour, Mr Major said that electing a Labour government would be playing Russian roulette with 6 bullets in the chamber. Britain's economic recovery would be put at risk. The federalists in Brussels would be putting the champagne on ice, and the United Kingdom would be endangered. But then, in this battle for trust, Jon Major launched a bitter and personal attack on the Labour leader after his comments that the state pension would be at risk if the Tories won.
Suddenly to produce a smear like that, to attack the most vulnerable people in our community, the pensioners, and frighten them with their future, is an unscrupulous and blatantly dishonest piece of politics, the like of which we rarely have seen. Trust, Mr Blair, trust. You forfeited trust with those blatant untruths repeated again and again and again.
Though this audience might harbour doubts about their prospects on Thursday, there was no lack of fighting spirit on show here tonight. This time tomorrow, Jon Major will be back in Huntingdon, his campaign complete. The Tories' last hope is that the millions of undecided voters will suddenly swing in the final hours behind them. And that's why this morning the Deputy Prime Minister, who's consistently said that the Tories would win with a majority of 60, was conjuring a rather different scenario.
This country is sleepwalking into the sort of disastrous policies that Labour in power have always been responsible for.
It was in pursuit of the don't knows and won't says that the Prime Minister went to marginal Brighton this morning. But as he left after a brief walkabout, the buskers played on. They weren't playing his tune. Jon Sopel, BBC News, with the major campaign.
Tony Blair insisted tonight the election result wasn't a foregone conclusion and that he'd be working flat out for every last vote. In a speech in Bristol, he said that all Labour wanted was a chance to serve. Our political editor, Robin Oakley, has been with the Blair campaign.
Bristol, Tuesday. More handshakes, more balloons, and a growing sense of expectation. But never mind the opinion polls. 2 days out from the election, Tony Blair is still fighting for every vote. His opening theme in this election was leadership and trust, and it's his theme for the final days as well.
The buck will stop with me and with my team. I will only promise what I can deliver, and I will deliver what I have promised. And that would be a difference, would it not, from these Conservative years?
Accusing the Tories of creating a two-tier society, he repeated his predecessor John Smith's insistence that all he wanted was the chance to serve, and he set out the kind of society he'd seek to create.
To believe that you can have a nation in which people are ambitious, in which people want to get on and prosper and do well, where they want their children to do better than they did, the great British dream that I would like to see back in this country, so that each generation does better than the last. We want that type of society. But the difference is, we want it for all our people, not just a privileged few, all of them.
There was, too, a snap back at Michael Heseltine's sleepwalking jibe.
The disaster is a Tory fifth term, and the British people aren't sleeping, they've woken up to it, and that's why they're turning to today's Labour Party.
Politics is a high-speed, high-altitude business these days. Earlier, his 345th interview completed, Mr. Blair had flown from London to Gloucester. At a jazz barbecue, New Labour's version of the garden party, his mission there was meeting Tories who'd switched to Labour. It's the seat whose capture would signal the almost certain arrival of a Labour government. Aboard the Blair battle bus en route for Bristol, I asked him what was actually achieved by all these photo opportunities.
Is it the importance of the message that you get across on these nationwide tours, or is it just the importance of being seen in different areas to stimulate political activity in them?
I think, I mean, obviously being there helps get people motivated, but I think this is an election in which photo opportunities don't count for a great deal. You've got to deliver a message. And if you're not delivering a message, then and saying how you believe you can make the country better or change it and do the things on schools and hospitals and jobs and all the rest of it, if you're not doing that, I don't think it counts for a great deal.
In Bristol this evening, the audience certainly warmed to that message. Reassurance, not revolution, has been Mr. Blair's message in what's largely been a cautious election campaign. He's been determined to avoid any note of triumphalism. But here in Bristol tonight, in a hall they could have filled twice over, there's been no doubt of the excitement in Labour's ranks that 23 years after their last general election victory, they're on their way to another. On Friday, they'll know. Robin Oakley, BBC News, Bristol.
Paddy Ashdown said he believed the Liberal Democrats were on the verge of an historic breakthrough and urged voters to choose a healthier, wealthier and fairer Britain. Mr Ashdown travelled further than the other party leaders today. His helicopter tour of the party's 21 key marginal seats got into full swing today in the West and Wales. The first stop was Cheltenham, followed by Hereford, then Wales and a visit to Cardiff, back on the helicopter to Bath, followed by the seafront at Weston-super-Mare, the beach at Minehead, then Shepton Mallet for a rally of party supporters, before finally returning to London. Our correspondent Carolyn Quinn was with him.
The size of the crowds has been taking Paddy Ashdown and his team genuinely by surprise on this whistle-stop tour, particularly a rock-star welcome in Hereford, when he was virtually mobbed during his 20-minute touchdown on the ground. In Cheltenham, the party was keen to show off its latest and oldest convert, 101-year-old Elizabeth Gresham, who decided to switch allegiance to the Liberal Democrats after 70 years supporting the Tories.
They haven't done what they said they would do. And they're having too much for themselves and not enough for the older and poorer people.
The party claim their private canvassing shows they're sustaining and gaining support. That's why they say these fleeting visits from Paddy Ashdown are so vital.
There were 7 landings scheduled in target constituencies today. For hours this helicopter's been in the air, ferrying Paddy Ashdown across the south and west. But the average time penciled in for him to actually meet the people on the ground is only about half an hour.
Thank you very much, and thanks for keeping me
on the ground, tension began to show as the time slipped away.
Oh, this is the very last one, I fear. I'm so sorry.
But finally tonight, Paddy Ashdown made it to Shepton Mallet for his penultimate rally. Just a few moments to gather his thoughts before he delivered his speech. where he claimed his party was on the verge of an historic achievement.
I believe that we stand on the threshold of the greatest breakthrough this party has made in the last 50 years. But our fight for education, for the NHS, to give the police the resources they need, does not end on Thursday. It begins on Friday, through the next Parliament, armed with the votes that you give us.
With 1 day's campaigning left, Paddy Ashdown won't say how many seats constitute a breakthrough, but it's understood anything fewer than 25 to 30 would be regarded as disappointing. Carolyn Quinn, BBC News, with the Ashdown campaign.
And that's the news from the campaign trail for the moment. There'll be more later in the programme, including a live interview with Jon Major. But now the rest of the news. Loyalist prisoners at the Maze prison tied the election. But first to our final election interview with the party leaders. Tonight we're joined from Downing Street by the Prime Minister. Good evening, Prime Minister.
Good evening, Michael.
You claim credit for the things that you reckon the government has got right, but you've been pretty quiet about what you've got wrong, the fiasco over the RM, for instance. Wouldn't voters respect politicians like you more if you were to apologise for those things that you got wrong? Or does being Jon Major mean never having to say you're sorry?
Come off it, Michael. I've spoken about the ERM on a dozen times. And I've made the point publicly and privately on many occasions that the ERM turned out to be a political difficulty. Whether it was an economic disaster is a judgment that the economists won't be able to make for some time. It probably did help us get inflation down and thence interest rates down, and help prepare for the most buoyant economic conditions we've had for generations, which is what we've got now. But as to the fact that it was a political mistake, I've said that on many occasions.
You say Mr. Blair should not be trusted because he promises not to raise taxes, and you say it's inevitable that he will. But isn't that exactly what you did last time? Why should voters trust you this time?
Actually, what I've been saying about Mr. Blair is that he asked us just a few days ago to trust him 20 times when he launched his manifesto. Within a very few days of asking us to trust him 20 times, he actually changed that manifesto 5 or 6 times. And in the last couple of days, he's been running a scare campaign on 2 issues, on subjects he knows are just not true. He knows we have no intention of putting value-added tax on food. He knows there is no danger whatsoever to the state retirement pension, and I repeat that absolutely emphatically tonight. But he and his colleagues have repeatedly said that, just a matter of days after asking people to trust them.
But you are asking the voters to trust you, and you broke your promise on tax at the last election.
Well, let us actually examine what I did at the last election. The tax burden is level from the time I became Prime Minister to now. It's at the same percentage as it was then. Taxes went up during the recession to help people who are vulnerable. They're now coming down. Indeed, people getting their pay packet in the next day or so will notice that taxes have come down by another penny in the pound and an over-indexation of allowances this month.
By common consent, this has been the most bad-tempered election campaign since the war. Who do you blame for that?
Well, firstly, I don't share the common consent that you refer to. But I have to say the 2 deeply unpleasant aspects of this campaign have been the proposition, utterly untruthful, that the government proposed to tax food. We've never had that intention. We're not going to do it. And the proposition from the Labour Party that I mentioned a moment ago, that the state retirement pension was at risk. Now, those were both utterly untruthful and, frankly, disreputable. But I think that is a question best directed at the leader of the Labour Party and not at me.
But it was your party's poster that showed a tiny Mr. Blair on the knee of a very large Chancellor Cole, sketched indeed by your deputy Prime Minister. Is that something you now regret?
Well, I think there was also a poster of me facing both ways with very odd statements about value-added tax attached to them by the Labour Party. So let's deal with the serious issues. Politics is a rough trade. Of course, party leaders get lampooned from time to time. That's been so since the beginning of time. But that's in a wholly different dimension from straightforward untruths, which is what we have had, I fear, from the Labour Party on several occasions in this campaign.
It has been a very personal campaign. There's obviously lots of posturing in any election, but how do you feel personally about Mr. Blair? Do you like him or do you detest him?
No, of course I don't detest him, no. We're political opponents. I don't doubt Mr. Blair's ambitions and his aspirations, or indeed Mr. Ashdown's for that matter. Where we have disagreements is on disagreements upon policy about how to achieve things that we both wish for our country. And we both put forward robustly those things that we think are right, and I think that's necessary. If politicians aren't able to have those sort of exchanges, then democracy itself is denied the choice it needs.
But even tonight you were calling him unscrupulous, untruthful, talking about him making smears.
I was making the point that I made just a moment or so ago to you. I think when a political party like the Labour Party sets out to repeat, not just once in hot blood, but as a cold, calculated campaign, time after time after time, two things that it knows to be untrue, the first about food and the second about the state retirement pension. Rough things about other politicians, I think, are part of the rough trade of politics. If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. But when you actually produce a charge like that will frighten and worry many vulnerable people, then I think that is in a different dimension. When we introduced our pension plans some weeks ago, there wasn't a peep from the Labour Party to suggest they thought the state retirement pension was in danger. Not a peep, because they knew it wasn't. Indeed, they welcomed it. It's only in the last few days of the campaign that they've seen this as, firstly, as a stick with which to beat the Conservatives with, and they have not cared that it would have frightened and worried many vulnerable people. To them, it was just a political weapon, and I think that is unscrupulous.
Mr. Major, a 6-week campaign, your choice. You seem to have dodged about a bit on the issues, on what you're concentrating on. First tax, then devolution, then Europe, and then back to tax. Downing Street and Central Office are reported to be at loggerheads over the strategy, and you appear to be even further behind in the polls than you were to start with. Has it all gone according to plan from your point of view?
Dodged about on the issues. Dodged about on the issues.
I mean,
this campaign is about a whole series of issues, Michael. You journalists may wish to set one particular issue as the predominant issue, but there are a whole series of things. Europe, education, health, taxation, environment, all these are legitimate issues. That's what general elections are about. I have tried to address those issues right the way through the campaign. I think it was right to. That's my responsibility. That's what I've done. It's what the 30 million people who will cast their votes on Thursday would have liked to have heard. The detailed explanation of the issues on health, on welfare, on education. That's not dodging about the issues. That's dealing with the matters of interest to the people who are going to vote in this election and determine the next government of this country.
You may decry and be suspicious of the polls, but even you must admit there's an outside chance that Tony Blair may have the keys to number 10 after Friday. If that is the verdict of the British people, how will you feel at that particular moment?
Well, the British people are sovereign. All politicians are the servants of the British nation. They're electors and they're dismissers. That is the role of democracy, and politicians accept that. What we also do is fight to the end for the principles we believe in, for the policies we believe in. And I am, as you say, rather dismissive of opinion polls. They were proved wrong in the last election. I believe they will be proved wrong in this general election. And what we should be concentrating on, what we should be debating, discussing, considering, are the issues of the campaign, not relative irrelevancies that comment on the campaign like opinion polls.
Mr. Major, 24 hours before the last election, you said you were stone cold certain you would win. 24 hours around that before this one. Will you say that again, that you're stone cold certain you will win?
I think this election is there to be won. I think this election is there to be won. There are a lot of people who are undecided. There are also, I think, from the canvass returns that we have, a lot of people who are undeclared, at least to the opinion polls. I believe this election is there to be won, yes.
You're not prepared to say you're stone cold certain, then?
I say this election is there to be won.
Mr. Major, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now we go over to Anne Perkins at our Westminster campaign desk for her nightly election roundup.
Evening, Michael. Paddy Ashdown may have stopped briefly in Wales today, but his party's key policy of devolution hasn't played a big part in the campaign there. The parties have concentrated on more familiar topics.
Campaigning in Wales has been focused on bread-and-butter issues like jobs, education and health. No mention of devolution in Paddy Ashdown's whistle-stop speech at Cardiff Castle this afternoon. Here, as elsewhere, the Liberal Democrat campaign has stressed the extra investment they're promising in education and health.
We've been campaigning on exactly the same themes as in the rest of the country, but we've been emphasising that in Wales, devolution, improving the quality of government, bringing it closer to the people, is the way to provide better education, better health care.
For the Conservatives, it's their success in bringing in new jobs through inward investment. Welsh Secretary William Hague, visiting a nappy factory, warned that Labour's plans for a Welsh Assembly would threaten that success.
The Conservative Party stands in this election for more jobs for the people of Wales. Other parties stand for more jobs for the politicians of Wales in a new tier of government. People need to vote on Thursday as if their job depends on it.
Plaid Cymru have made an attack on Labour's Assembly plans a centrepiece of their campaign.
They say it would be a powerless talking shop. The people could change that by voting nationalist.
If they want a parliament that treats Wales as a nation with the same respect as the Scottish nation is being treated with regard to the parliament they are being offered, then it is not the vote for Labour that delivers that on Thursday. It is the vote for Plaid Cymru.
A Welsh Assembly is the first of Labour's key pledges for Wales. John Prescott happily signing up to them. But Labour have said little about devolution over the last 6 weeks. Is that because they don't see it as a central issue?
Everybody knows the Labour Party's commitment here in Wales to devolution. I think the main issues, however, are the incompetence of the present government and the way that they have abused the over-centralisation of power. So it hasn't been a main theme, but it has informed the debate on the delivery of public services.
It's ironic that, as in Scotland, it's the other political parties which have done most of the talking about Labour's devolution plans in this campaign. But if Labour wins, a whole new campaign would begin for the devolution referendum. Glyn Mathias, BBC News, South Wales.
For days there's been gossip in the Conservative camp about the Tory leadership in the event of electoral defeat. Two possible challengers, Michael Howard and Michael Heseltine, were at a news conference this afternoon. Mr Heseltine's critics say he'll be too old at the next election. This, though, is the kind of question which has to be raised obliquely.
I can't find anyone among my colleagues who can remember how old Disraeli was when he became Prime Minister, and I wondered whether you had a view about when it was too old to lead the country.
I don't see the point of doing any historic research into this issue, because whilst it might have been fascinating in the case of Benjamin Disraeli in the 19th century, it is self-evident that all of us in the room, after a little research, know the age of the present Prime Minister who's about to be re-elected. Which is? Perhaps I hoped you wouldn't ask.
Well, Mr Major is 54. Mr Heseltine is 64, and so was Disraeli when he first became Conservative Prime Minister in 1868. Asian voters could decide the outcome of no fewer than 36 seats in the election, and the parties have been working hard for their support. 5 of them have recorded election broadcasts for an Asian cable channel, and the SNP has set up Scots Asians for Independence. But as our Community Affairs correspondent Reeta Chakrabarti reports, their efforts are being regarded with a degree of scepticism.
Samosas and bhajis were on the menu for Michael Howard on a visit to the mosque in Regent's Park in central London. Members of all 3 main parties have, on separate occasions, been pressing the flesh here, as well as trying to address some of the community's main concerns. Top of the agenda here is the issue of religious discrimination and of state-funded Muslim schools. Observers listen politely but sceptically. Chowdhury Nain Uddin is vice-chairman of a mosque in East London. He says politicians are just going through the motions.
Our politicians suffer from a measure of arrogance, if you like, and they take a patronizing view of Muslims, which doesn't help.
Priorities within the Asian community vary as widely as elsewhere. For the affluent business sector, it's the economy. In the East End, it's more likely to be unemployment and housing.
When election comes, they promise a lot of things, but when they're in power, they forget.
Well, because of the voting system, they're here. Otherwise, we don't see them around.
The Muslim and wider Asian community have been courted quietly but assiduously during this campaign, particularly by the Conservatives, who sense that of all the minority communities, this is the one to whom they can appeal the most. But in 1992, Labour took 3/4 of the Asian vote. Eroding that level of support will still be an uphill task. Reeta Chakrabarti, BBC News, Whitechapel.
Some voters think there's an undue degree of convergence between Labour and Conservatives on policy, but it goes further. Yesterday, Mr Major was wearing a blue spotty tie, and so was Mr Blair. On election call this morning, it was larger spots, same blue background.
I think Mr Blair's tie says it all this morning. He's a plastic Tory.
It's a bit of a, I was going to say, a red rag to a bull to some old Labour supporters.
What, wearing a blue tie?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, the choice of my tie is something that's made pretty quickly in the morning, the first thing that comes out the drawer, so I wouldn't read too much into it.
And that's all from us. Back to you, Mike.
And thanks. After almost 6 weeks of the longest election campaign this century, it's thought that 10% of the electorate have still to make up their minds about which way they'll vote. And it could be these people, many in suburban marginal seats, whose votes will decide which party is in government on Friday morning. Our correspondent Peter Morgan has been on a whistle-stop tour of Middle England in search of suburban voters. He's been to Stevenage, held by the Tories with an estimated majority of under 3,000 after boundary changes. Also to the Midlands constituency of Redditch, 44th on Labour's list of target seats. But first to Pudsey, which the Conservatives hold with a majority of 8,000.
Tony Blair knew he'd lost the last election when he met a man polishing his car on a suburban estate somewhere in Middle England.
I met a man polishing his Ford Sierra, self-employed electrician, Dad always voted Labour. He used to vote Labour, he said. But he bought his own home, he'd set up his own business, he was doing quite nicely. So he said, I've become a Tory.
In that one moment of enlightenment, Tony Blair staked out the critical battleground for this election. The fight for the heart and mind of what became dubbed Sierra Man had been joined. In the well-kept back streets of constituencies like Pudsey near Leeds live the crucial swing voters who'll decide the outcome of this election. Families like the Guns. John Gunn is doing well, selling for a major printing company. The Guns are typical of many voters nowadays who are influenced far more by issues than by traditional party loyalties. Gail is a teacher, and that's reflected in her voting intentions.
My main concern as a teacher and a parent is education. I would very much like to see some more nursery places for our young children.
John's upgrading his car. It's part of the better future he wants to secure for his family.
So this is the 5-door version, the long wheelbase version. It's a 2.7 turbo diesel.
John will decide how to vote the same way as he chooses his Ford, looking for the best package of features and finance on offer. His father always voted Labour, but John doesn't see things like that.
I have sort of views on certain things, and I say, yes, this party will help me there, this party will help me there. And yes, I do sort of tend to lean towards one side. But on 2 or 3 of the other issues, I'm still ready to be swayed, I suppose. And if I am swayed the right way, I will change my vote, no two ways about it.
The laser-like focus on swing voters and marginal constituencies by the main political parties comes as no surprise to Professor Paul Whiteley at Sheffield University.
In the 50s, politics was tribal. Working class people would vote Labour, middle class people would vote Conservative, and that was it. Now, people are much more willing to shift and choose. There's less party loyalty. Sierra Man is willing to switch sides if he thinks that one party will do better than another. His father, back in the 50s, most probably would have been Labour regardless.
100 miles to the south lies the key marginal seat of Redditch in the West Midlands. This is a new town positively bristling with Mondeo and Sierra families, with only hazy memories of what life was like under a Labour government.
When the Labour were in power, I heard a lot of stories as I was growing up of the mistakes they made with the unions, etc. And a lot of my family, who was staunch Labour, changed radically because they let them down all those years ago.
And Tony Blair hasn't restored your trust?
Well, no,
well, Labour Party haven't.
I can't see why, you know.
Yeah, I know that there's a lot of talk about the sleaze and there's a lot of backbiting, but nobody's actually telling you what they're actually going to do for you at the moment.
And remember the man who Tony Blair met polishing his Sierra? Duncan Lee may be cleaning his motorbike, but he has just started his own business, and the principle's much the same.
Excuse me, I wonder if I could ask you how you're going to vote in the election?
Well, to be perfectly honest, I'm not really sure. I've always been a Labour man because really that's the way I was brought up. My parents were Labour. I'm from a working class background. But I think now maybe that if I'm looking for a party that's going to look after me best as a man on my own, as it were, trying to make my way in the world, then maybe the Conservative Party is better for me now.
And so, on again, heading south. At the last election, the Conservatives won Stevenage with a majority of 5,000. But boundary changes have cut that majority in half. Now Labour needs a swing of less than 3% to take this seat, it's Labour's best hope of victory in the wealthy county of Hertfordshire. At the brand new David Lloyd Fitness Centre, the citizens of Stevenage are working hard to ensure a healthy and vigorous future. The main political parties have correctly identified their concerns: law and order, health, education, but they've failed to evoke strong loyalty.
I usually vote Conservative. I'm very confused this time. I have considered Labour. I think if I vote Lib Dem, I might be throwing my vote away, so I'm really confused.
Personally, sitting on the fence because, you know, the 6 of one and half a dozen the other. So I might change my mind before the time, but if I don't, I probably won't even vote.
I have not made my mind up. I never thought I'd be a floating voter, but this time I am.
Why?
There's a part of me that thinks that the Tories have had their time. I have no problem with what they've achieved. I think they've achieved a great deal, but it may be now time to have a new broom through the cupboard.
Politicians and pundits predict the election will turn on less than 100 seats.
The battleground of marginal seats is about, say, 90 seats or thereabouts. What you have to think of is within those seats are a group of middle ground voters who are willing to switch. And so if you boil it down, the outcome of the election is decided by a relatively modest number of voters, probably a couple of 100,000.
The election has seen increasingly...
Millions of words have been broadcast and published in the most carefully focused electoral campaign in British political history. Yet the tantalising conclusion of this journey is that many of the critical swing voters of Middle Britain have yet to make up their minds.
Peter Morgan reporting. The main election headlines tonight. John Major has said on this programme a few minutes ago that the election was still there to be won, but wouldn't say he was certain of victory. And he accused Labour of running a calculated scare campaign over pensions and VAT. Earlier, Tony Blair said the voters have woken up to the disaster of a fifth Tory government. He said that all Labour wanted was a chance to serve. And Paddy Ashdown has talked about the greatest third-party breakthrough since the war. Well, joining me from Bristol, where he's been following Tony Blair's campaign, is our political editor, Robin Oakley. Robin, Labour's keen not to look too cocky, but is there excitement in the Labour camp over apparently being so close to power?
Well, the word landslide is certainly banned in Mr. Blair's entourage, and anybody who even finds themselves talking about victory too openly slaps themselves on the wrist as if they've been caught smiling at a funeral. But there's a sort of feeling of suppressed elation now in Labour's ranks, and one veteran campaigner said to me this morning that they're going round asking each other, pinch me, because they simply cannot believe that the poll gap hasn't started to close as they expected it to do, just like their opponents and most of the media. So it has to be said, of course, that the Liberal Democrats are in a pretty cheery condition too, because they today had the oldest defector in this election campaign, a 101-year-old lady, Elizabeth Gresham, who's voted Tory all her life and now come over to them.
So elated and trying hard not to show it. What about the Tories? Depressed and trying hard not to show it?
Well, Mr. Major has all through been amazingly resilient and good-tempered through all the provocation of the election press conferences. Michael Heseltine is fighting, as he says, to the last man and the last round. But I think among some of the others about them now, there's a bit of a mood creeping over of, well, we've had a good innings, haven't we? And their real hope is that people will look now at the headlines saying Labour by a landslide and will switch back to them at the last minute, because while they may be ready for time for a change, they don't want Labour in by that sort of margin.
Robin, thanks very much indeed. And that's the news tonight. Newsnights on BBC 2 at 10:35. Full coverage of the general election results will be provided by BBC News throughout Thursday night on BBC 1 and radios 4 and 5 Live. But that's all from the 9 o'clock news. Good night.